Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Plant Path. Appreciate you taking the time out of your life to join me here. And in this episode, I'm going to be discussing some dynamics around sympathetic medicine in the practice of astro-herbalism. Now, you might be wondering, what is sympathetic medicine? Is that where you just have the utmost empathy and love and care for the people that you work with? Well, yes, hopefully you should have those things when you're working with clients. You should certainly have empathy. But when I'm talking about sympathetic medicine, that's not really what we're talking about. This is a concept that goes back to the time of Paracelsus, the Swiss alchemist and physician. This is a concept much exemplified throughout the Hermetic tradition, alchemy, and the practice of medicine, Paracelsian medicine, as well as in the development of Hahnemann's homeopathy. But I want to discuss it here in the context of astro-herbalism. Now, basically we have, let's give a little context here. So sympathetic medicine is in contrast to antipathetic medicine. Antipathetic medicine is a little easier to describe, so I'll talk about that first. And it's very simple. Opposites balance. So if you are too hot, you cool someone down. If they're too dry, you moisten them. If they're too moist, you dry them out. If they're too tense, you relax them. Antipathetic medicine is really at the basis of most systems of herbal medicine around the world. Ayurveda is antipathetic medicine. Chinese medicine is antipathetic. Greek humoral medicine, Unani Tib, these are all antipathetic systems of medicine whereby we are using opposite qualities in the remedies to balance the opposing quality within the person of the disease. And so it's a very logical system. It makes sense. Sympathetic medicine does not, right? This is, in a way, I like to think of it as illogical medicine, or not illogical, but beyond logic. Sympathetic medicine essentially can be looked at from a few different perspectives. Now, a lot of the ways that it's typically defined and discussed is in the context of homeopathy, right? Like treats like, similia curantur similia, right? The old premise of homeopathic medicine, which is based on this. If you take a remedy in a very, very high dose, it will tend to generate the symptoms, the pattern that it addresses in a very low dose, like a minuscule dose, like a physically barely existent dose, right? That is one of the principles of homeopathic medicine. And of course, there's a whole system in place in terms of how those medicines are diluted and potentized and what layer of the person are they used for, more acute or chronic or deeper or superficial, etc. I'm not a homeopath. I'm not an expert in that, but that is one example of the application of sympathetic medicine. Now, when we're looking at alchemical medicine, Paracelsianism, it's a little bit different. And this is where the planetary piece comes into play. So according to Paracelsus, he says that, quote, every planet cures its own disease. And this is one of the basis for astrological correspondences in herbal medicines and, in higher alchemy, the mineral and metallic medicines. But for our purposes, we'll focus on plants because they're much more safe and gentle. And, if you give the wrong one or don't prepare it correctly, it will kill you. So always good to use the lower plant alchemy when you're just getting started. The premise here is that a plant is correlated to a particular planet sympathetically, meaning that plant embodies characteristics of that planet, which are then conveyed to the person that ingests that plant specifically when it has been prepared alchemically, because the alchemical or spagyric preparations concentrate those astral forces in the cosmos within to the medicine according to the tradition, and then that astral force is then conveyed to the person that takes the spagyric remedy. And so the thought there is that because every planet cures its own disease, when we are working within more of this alchemical framework of herbal medicine, we assess the person, their pattern of symptomatic expression, their constitution, their psychological emotional state, and decipher what the primary planetary afflicting planet is. What is the archetypal force behind the problems that they're facing, basically? And then you choose a specific remedy that is sympathetic to that planetary force in order to correct that within the person. Now, the way I've heard a lot of people in the alchemy world, is just like, hey, here's a list of Mars herbs. Just pick a Mars herbs to cure the Mars problem. As an herbalist, I get a little like, there's like lots of different Mars plants. Nettle leaf is very different from echinacea flower, is very different from cayenne. Those are all very different herbs. And yes, they all embody Mars, but in very different ways. And so what I wanted to go through here is talk about the way I tend to think of layers of sympathy between a plant and a planet. And I think that there are, in my experience, my understanding of studying this and working with this for in my opinion, a pretty long time, that there is a spectrum of sympathy and antipathy between a plant and a planet. And there's different layers of sympathy between a plant and a planet. So I wanted to go through those a little bit and just describe this, kind of tease this out a little bit more. The concept of sympathetic medicine can be kind of complicated. I remember when I was writing my book, Evolutionary Herbalism. If you don't have a copy of Evolutionary Herbalism, you should pick yourself up a copy. But I remember I was writing a section on sympathetic medicine, and my friend and colleague Matthew Wood was helping review the book, and we were talking a lot while I was writing it, and we were talking about sympathetic medicine. He was like, God, this topic is really hard to talk about because in a way it's like a Zen cone. Like, what's the sound of one hand clapping? It's like everything about it is paradoxical almost. And in that way, it kind of, in a sense, it's almost transcendent of, it's almost like a transcendent function. And in that way, very hard to encapsulate with language. But let's talk about some layers of sympathy between a plant and a planet. So one of the first and primary ones, and this is like astro-herbalism, medical astrology 101, which would be organ system and tissue affinity. So this would be that planets tend to sympathetically correspond to certain parts of the body. Plants that also correspond to that part of the body could be said to be sympathetic to that planet and to that part of the body, right? There's a triangulation that happens there. So for example, we have, and this is just like a super quick run through, there's much more depth that could be gone into on this, but for example, Venus governing the kidneys and the female reproductive system, Mars governing the immune system, the adrenal glands, and the male reproductive system. You got Jupiter governing the liver and kind of metabolism as a whole. Saturn relating to the bones and the teeth and the structural tissues and the joints of the body. The sun relating to the heart and circulation and really the vital force as a whole. The moon as relating to the stomach and the fluids, the mucosa of the body. Mercury being the respiratory system, the brain, the nerves, and all of that. So this is one layer of sympathy that we can see between plant, planet, and person in that triangulation, that if there is an herb that, say there's an herb that has an influence on the blood and the immune system and the male reproductive system, such as nettles, different parts of the plant, but nettles as a whole does in fact impact those areas. That's a pretty strong sympathetic correlation to Mars, right? So that's a really good example of sympathetic principle of sympathy in terms of organ, system, and tissue affinity of the herbs. Then we have another layer of sympathy would be, the energetics. This is an important concept in holistic herbalism, whereby we're looking at the impact of a remedy on the ecological state of the body, as opposed to just looking at the more biochemical effects of a plant. So very simple principle, very powerful though. In that, so we have herbs that are warming, cooling, moistening, drying, tonifying, or astringing and relaxing. So for example, warming herbs can tend to be governed by Mars and the sun. Jupiter also to a lesser degree is warm. Cooling herbs, Saturn is very cold. The moon tends to be cooling. Moistening, the moon is the predominant moistening planet. Venus can be moistening as well in some instances, and Jupiter can be moistening specifically in terms of oiliness. This is actually a very interesting feature of Ayurveda, whereby they see the water element as a kind of a grand archetype, the hydration of the body as being twofold, water and oil. Oil being more the pitta form of the water element, water being more the kapha form of the water element. But Jupiter really encompasses that in the way that it rules fats and oils. Drying, the sun, Mars are very drying by virtue of their heating quality. Saturn is very drying, tonifying, astringent. Mercury can be drying too, simply by nature of it is very movement oriented. Relaxant, Mercury and Venus can be relaxant. Tonic astringent, Saturn tends to be tonic astringent. So these are some different ways that planets can be understood sympathetically through their energetics. And this, in combination with organ affinities, can tend to lend a lot of insights into an herb and what planet is most sympathetic to that herb. So that is a really good foundation. Now, there's a lot more depth one can go into in terms of herbal actions, thinking through the actions of a plant, such as demulcent herbs tend to be very moistening to the mucosal membrane. Well, that's a very lunar quality, right? Moistening is the moon. The mucosal membranes are ruled by the moon, and demulcents do exactly that. So it's a very good example of a sympathetic property of the moon. So there's obviously lots of herbal actions, lots of interesting correlations that can be drawn between the actions and the planetary qualities. And basically you go about building a case. You map the herb out in terms of its organ affinities, organ system tissue affinities, the actions that it has, the energetics, and then you see all the correspondences to each of those individual characteristics. And then you start building a case for like, oh, there's a predominance of moon stuff going on here. And this is one of the ways that I go about attributing planetary correspondences to plants. As you might be able to see, the synergy between astrological medicine and clinical herbalism can be complex. There's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of dynamics, And there's a lot of fundamental principles and practices that you really have to understand in order to apply this in your work with people and plants effectively. So if you're maybe feeling like some of this is a little bit over your head, or if you're just like, this is awesome, amazing, I want more, I want to make sure that you know about something special that is happening very soon here at the School of Evolutionary Herbalism. Save the date on your calendar, March 25th, 2025, we will be opening up our 100% free astro-herbalism mini course. This is an in-depth workshop series that is 100% free, where you can dig into significant more depth and detail on the synergy between astrology and herbal medicine. We're going to be covering some of the fundamentals of how the fundamental pattern behind astrology and holistic herbal medicine is essentially the same to anatomy and physiology and properties of herbs, how to relate the plants to the planets, and how to put it all together through the use of the natal chart. Don't miss out on the free astro-herbalism mini course. Mark the date on your calendar, March 25th. Head on over to evolutionaryherbalism.com. Be sure to sign up for our email list so you can get the announcement, be first in line, join the waiting list, and be sure to join me on March 25th, 2025 for the Astro Herbalism mini course. And with that, let's get back to learning about planetary sympathy. Now, the third thing that you could do aside from energetics and organ system tissue affinity is the types of conditions treated. Now, this is oftentimes synonymous with organ system and tissue affinities. So if you're thinking of, say, respiratory tract infections, an herb that treats respiratory tract infections. Well, you've got a couple factors here. You've got Mercury, which relates to the respiratory tract, but you also have Mars here, in that Mars tends to relate to infections and the immune system and the inflammatory process that ensues. So there's lots of layers to that. And then you drill down deeper of like, okay, well, what type of herb is it? You've got Osha is used to treat respiratory tract infections, and marshmallow can be used to treat respiratory tract infections, totally different herbs. And so that's where you dig into the quality of the energetics, the actions, and things like that to further clarify. Conditions like anemia or blood deficiency or hemochromatosis. These are all blood disorders. These would be predominantly associated with Mars. So you can see that there's a strong organ correlation with disease and pathology and the rulerships of that. But there are many instances where further detail is required. Like we could say, something that's relatively simple like constipation. Okay, constipation relates to the digestive system. There's aspects of the moon involved. The moon rules the stomach. Generally, the intestinal tract is governed by there's sign correspondences too, which adds another layer of complexity, but Virgo tends to rule the small intestine, Scorpio, the large intestine. But we could say, there's people get constipation for different reasons, right? For some instances, it might be a deficiency of the moon and there's too much dryness there. In some instances, there might be, a deficiency of heat and cold present in the digestive system. So a lack of the sun or a lack of Mars present, maybe an excess of Saturn that's present there at the cause of the issue. And so this is where we get into the complexity of this type of system, whereby a single plant can have sympathetic attributes to a planet and antipathetic attributes to a planet. So a really interesting example of this would be nettles, right? Nettle leaf and Mars. So nettle leaf is sympathetic to Mars in that it is operating upon the blood. It is, on the one hand, nourishing the blood. So it is like a builder. But yet it's also alterative and cleansing and purifying to the blood. The root is affinity for the prostate gland, also ruled by Mars. Of course, morphologically, nettles has a lot of Mars signatures as well, with its prickliness and sharpness and stingingness, and you get red and hot and inflamed, and that's all Mars stuff too. But yet, nettles treats an excess of Mars, right? Heat, irritation, allergies, kind of that immune hypersensitivity, nettles is really excellent for. So on the one way, it's sympathetic to Mars in its organ affinities, and it's also sympathetic to Mars in that it can treat Mars conditions, which in some ways it could be seen as being antipathetic. Nettles also has operations on the opposite planet, Venus, because it's a diuretic and operates through the kidneys and urinary tract. So there's some very interesting spectrums that we can consider of sympathy and antipathy within a plant. Another really interesting one is agrimony, Agrimonia eupatoria. This is an herb I tend to place under Venus because it has such a strong affinity for the urinary tract and for the kidneys. And it's interesting because it is a kidney urinary tract remedy, which is Venusian. Yet it's astringent, it tonifies, so it can be really great for people with an excess of Venus that causes too much relaxation, because Venus tends to be relaxed in nature, causes too much relaxation in the bladder, in the urinary tract. And then agrimony goes in there and it tonifies all that. It kind of tightens and astringes and brings more structural definition and tone to the tissues of the urinary tract. So it's treating an excess of Venus, an excess of that relaxation in the venous organ system. But yet the Venusian quality tends to be relaxant in nature. Astringency tends to be more Saturnian. But it's treating Venus. So again, it's Venus treating a Venusian imbalance, that being relaxation. And yet, Matthew talks about agrimony, and this is based a little more on, I believe, the flower essence indications, but as being a remedy for tension, a remedy for psychological tension, a remedy for kind of hierarchical issues within relationships oftentimes, especially work relationships or challenges with authority, if you have an issue with your boss at work or something like that. And people that tend to wear a facade on their face, like they're not doing well, and they're not doing well, and you're like, hey, so-and-so, how you doing? And they're like, I'm fine, and you're like, you're not fine. So that's one of the patterns of agrimony, is like that facade kind of being fake in a way, like maybe they're faking it till they make it, but it's not really convincing anyone. And so there's just some interesting, so it has a relaxant effect there, which is Venusian. Again, a spectrum of sympathy and antipathy can be present within plants. And one of the ways that I've been starting to think about this is a more in-depth way to classify and understand planetary correspondences. So typically the way people think of a planetary correspondence in a plant is, this herb is ruled by this planet, right? Agrimony is ruled by Venus. Nettles is ruled by Mars. And that's good. I think it's a good starting place. And this is how I've worked with it for years. And over the time of developing my system and really working on these correspondences and thinking them through, and really the further in depth going into it, realizing that there's a lot of complexity with plant to planet correspondences and sympathies. And so it dawned on me a few years ago when I was studying with the great herbalist David Winston, as he was teaching the system of formulation and classification that he had originally learned from one of his teachers, William Lesaussier. And William Lesaussier, has really taught some of the greats of great herbalists of our modern era. Matthew Wood studied with him, Margie Flint studied with him, David Winston studied with him. I know lots of others did. I'm sure. I just don't know, but I know those three did for sure. And they're fantastic herbalists and different herbalists, but fantastic nonetheless. So the basis of Lesaussier's system is called the triune system. And it's a way of classifying a plant based on an organ affinity, and then whether that herb is a builder, an eliminator, or a neutral to that organ system. Now, each organ system is going to have different qualifying factors in terms of like what qualifies an herb to be a respiratory tract builder, what types of qualities are respiratory tract eliminators, right? Like a respiratory tract builder would be like lung trophorrestoratives and tonics, demulcents that nourish and build respiratory tissue. Eliminators would be like stimulant expectorants and things like that. So each organ system has those different qualities. And when I was learning this, I was thinking, boy, builder, neutral, eliminator, that sure is a threefold pattern. And for any of you that have been following me for some time, I'm a big fan of patterns, and I'm a big fan of threefold patterns. And because I find there is a universality to threefold patterns amongst various traditions from around the world. Vata, Pitta, Kapha of Ayurveda being a good example. Mercury, sulfur, and salt of alchemy. Cardinal, mutable, and fixed of astrology. These are all threefold patterns. The triune constitutional system, Sheldon's constitutional system. I totally had a brain lapse there for a moment. The mesomorph, ectomorph, and endomorph, very similar to Vata, Pitta, Kapha, but lots of threefold patterns. And what I find is that the builder is like a salt quality from an alchemy perspective. Neutrals would be Mercury, the balancing force, and the eliminators would be sulfur, which tends to be hot and fiery and more, I guess, destructive, so to speak, eliminating, stimulating. So the way that I've begun to think about this concept of to refine our understanding of a sympathetic correspondence between a plant and a planet is to further define how is that plant sympathetically related to that planet. Is that plant building that planetary quality? So for example, because nettles is such a common herb that a lot of people are familiar with, I like using it as an example. So nettles, in terms of the blood, we could think of it as a builder to Mars. It builds Mars because it's full of minerals and iron and builds blood. Okay, so that would be Mars, a Mars builder. But yet it's Mars eliminating too, right? Because it clears heat, it clears stagnation, it's alterative, right? So it's clearing a lot of that damp heat and irritation. So it's eliminating to Mars as well. I would also say it's eliminating to Venus because it's diuretic. So that's very interesting. We could also say the Mars building or the Mars eliminating aspect with the root in how it addresses benign prostatic hyperplasia or BPH, which is this abnormal swelling of the prostate gland. So if it's reducing that swelling, that's eliminating an excess. So that's Mars eliminating. And I would argue that I think nettles is a Mars neutral too. I think I find it to be a balancing force to the archetype of Mars. I think it's really great. So this has been the way that I've come to understand, and I think this is a way that we can refine our understanding for those of you that work with plant-to-planet correspondences I find that the concept of builder, neutral, eliminator to a planet is a very useful approach. It's something that I'm incorporating into my classification system. I'm actually got a big project of going through all my plant element plant correspondences and overlaying this builder, neutral, eliminator quality, because I think it clarifies more precisely what that herb is doing in regards to that planet. And I think it helps to eliminate some of the confusion that can arise with applying the principle of sympathetic medicine, whereby we say, oh, well, it's sympathetic to this organ system, but yet it's antipathetic because it's kind of opposing or balancing an excess of that planet. And it's like, well, no, maybe that's still a sympathetic influence. It's just an eliminator to an excess of that planet, not a builder and increasing that planet. So these are some of the ways that I've come to understand sympathetic medicine as it applies to astro-herbalism. And hopefully you find that insightful and useful and interesting in terms of working with a further layer of detail to our plant-to-planet correspondences, which has application in the practice of astro-herbalism, but also has great application in the practice of alchemical herbalism as well. So with that, I want to say thank you to you for making it to the end of this video. I really appreciate you watching to the end. It does help support the channel more than you might know. And if you have not done so already, I know there's a lot of you that watch and listen but aren't subscribed. So if you don't mind hitting that subscribe button so you can be notified whenever we're publishing new content, I would greatly appreciate it. It is a way that you can help support the channel so we can continue to produce what hopefully you find is valuable free content to the herbal community. And if you're anywhere other than evolutionaryherbalism.com, head on over to our website. We've got a lot of free resources available for you over there. Sign up for our newsletter so that you can get all of the updates and when we're opening enrollment and when we're doing free workshops and all of that good stuff. And I just want to say thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy day. It does mean a lot to me. I really appreciate it. And I want to wish you well on your plant path. And until the next episode, take care and be well.